I'm Heather Sweet, and welcome to the State of the Union. I will be your facilitator for this afternoon's session. I am actually an AUPE member and currently sit on the Committee for Political Action. I'm also a Next Up alumni and your provincial candidate for the NDP in Edmonton Manning. I'm extremely excited to be here. It's been a rough year, I guess, for the unions in Alberta. This presentation will examine the current state and the impacts of unions in Alberta, the recent trends in union membership, and organizing indicate that organized labor in Alberta is in a precarious position. But as the presentation will show, the evidence also indicates that unions nonetheless provide substantial economic and social benefits to the workers in the province. We have three panelists here today. First will be David Campanella. David was the research manager at the Parkland Institute from 2011 to 2014, where he researched issues of privatization, oil development, and healthcare. David also holds a master's degree in environmental studies from York University, where he focused on political economy. He now lives in Toronto. Elisabeth Ballermann will be our second speaker. She's currently the president of the Health Science Association of Alberta and has been since 1995. She's a graduate of the University of Alberta with both a bachelor's of science in physical therapy and in law. She was instrumental in bringing Health Sciences Association of Alberta into the House of Labour, and due to this involvement is a vice president of both the Alberta Federation of Labour and the National Union of Public and General Employees. Elisabeth also represents HSAA on the board of several community partner organizations, including the Friends of Medicare, Public Interest Alberta, and the Parkland Institute. HSAA has been working for a number of years to expand the conversation of unions to go beyond the limits of collective agreements and to the whole community of membership. Heather Smith is the president of the United Nurses of Alberta. Heather represents more than 30,000 registered nurses, registered psychiatric nurses, and allied healthcare workers throughout Alberta. Heather is a registered nurse, and after moving to Alberta from Ontario, she worked at the Edmonton General Hospital, where she served for 5 years as a president of UNA Local 79. She was elected to the presidency of UNA in 1988 and has served in that capacity ever since. She's been a member of UNA Provincial Negotiating Committees since 1985. Heather is an active supporter of the Parkland Institute and other groups dedicated to advocating for the protection and enhancement of universal public health care in Canada and Alberta.
I'm up. Hi, everybody. I'm really glad we could all be here together today to hear about the state of unions in Alberta. Early this year, I helped write a report called On the Job, Why Unions Matter in Alberta, which is the title of the presentation today, and I will be sharing with you some of our findings. We wrote the report at a time when the labor movement here in Alberta was facing particularly adverse conditions, mostly in the form of Bills 45 and 46. And some people were asking themselves whether unions were still relevant today and if they were an institution worth defending. So we took the opportunity to research union activity in the province and detail some of the real effects unions have in the province today. It was not comprehensive. I'm just going to flag that outright. Couldn't cover possibly everything that unions do and all the impacts that they have. We did focus on a couple aspects, though, that we thought were important and that could be thoroughly documented. So what we found were that there were at least two very important things that unions in Alberta today should be very proud of. But there are also things that indicate that the current trajectory the unions are on is unsustainable and that they need to rethink their strategy. But before we get to those points, I'd like to just articulate more clearly who exactly we're talking about when we say union members and unions in Alberta. This is the cover of the report. So who are union members? Well, just over half are female. This is a major change going back to the mid-70s when women made up 30% of union membership despite being 40% of the workforce. The vast majority of union members work in large organizations. So for instance, 81% work in organizations with over 500 employees, whereas only 44% of non-unionized employees work in similar organizations. They tend to be middle-aged. About 50% are over the age of 45, compared to about 30% of the population. And 15 to 24-year-old workers make up only 7% of union members, despite being 17% of provincial employees. So there's obviously a big gap in unionization there. Union members also tend to be better educated than the rest of the population. 70% have completed some form of post-secondary education compared to 55% of non-unionized employees. And the majority work in the public sector, primarily education, healthcare, social assistance, and public administration. So thus the typical union member today in Alberta is a well-educated, middle-aged woman working in the public sector. And this is a far cry from the old stereotype of a blue-collar male worker. This isn't something that's particularly unique to Alberta. This is mirrors a broader trend across Canada. And who are the unions that we're talking about? Well, there are 103 distinct unions and labor associations in Alberta. 93% of union members, though, belong to 30 of those unions, and 72% of union members belong to these 10 unions. So hopefully these are acronyms that some of you have seen before. I'm not going to spell out each one, but 5 of them are mostly public sector unions, 2 are private sector unions, there's 2 building trades, and of course there is CLAC, which is the Christian Labour Association of Canada. And I will just give a brief aside here on CLAC, because I think it's going to be important to future discussions. CLAC is a union really only in the literal sense that it represents employees in collective bargaining agreements with employers. CLAC consciously separates itself from the rest of the labor movement, which it classifies as adversarial, by espousing a more conciliatory approach to labor relations. And if you look back at CLAC's history, some of its tactics that it's used, it really shows itself to be, in effect, more of a Trojan horse for the interests of capital by undermining labor solidarity and crowding out real union organizing. So what can unions in Alberta be proud of? Well, the 2 things that we looked at were worker compensation and worker safety, and I'll go through each of these. So compensation. It's likely not a surprise that union members tend to earn better wages than their non-unionized counterparts. And economists call this the union wage premium. And the top, this top row there of the table shows that what our research found was that in 2013, so more or less the current union wage premium, in Alberta, overall was $4.75 an hour. And if you work that into a standard full-time, full-year schedule, that works out to roughly $10,000 per year. And this is an 18% increase over their non-unionized workers. As you can see here, it's also significantly higher for women as well as young workers. So there are some important pay equity effects happening. And we also broke down what the union premium was by industry. So we found that it was highest in construction at 35%, education at 26%, accommodation and food services at 22%, healthcare and social assistance at 21%, and information, culture, and recreation at 18%. But as you can see here, some industries actually had a negative union premium, meaning the non-unionized workers were on average earning more than their unionized counterparts. So these included non-durable manufacturing, transportation and warehousing, resource industries, and public administration. And these maybe are troubling findings, and more research could be done to drill down into exactly what's going on in these industries. But at least in public administration, the case for that negative union premium is that the sector is so heavily unionized that if you're not a union member, there's a good chance you work in management, which tends to be higher paying and often much higher paying. One need only look at the sunshine list to see how well some of our senior bureaucrats are compensated. So that would obviously skew the results. But what we also did was look at the wage premium by occupation. And this is a lot here. You don't necessarily need to go read through every one, but maybe you see yours and you're interested in your occupation. What we found was that doing this allowed us to separate management from the equation. And in doing so showed us that the non-managerial occupations in some of the industries I just mentioned, such as transportation and warehousing, as well as manufacturing, do have positive union premiums. And in almost every broad group of non-managerial occupations in the province, most of which are shown here, union wages are significantly higher than non-union wages. So the two exceptions where there's very small sample sizes are the business and finance professionals, as well as management, of course. But workers aren't just compensated through wages. There are also non-wage forms of compensation that we also wanted to include in our analysis. So we also looked at, for instance, pensions, health benefits, vacation pay, skills training, and paid sick leave, all of which are very important parts of income for a worker. Unlike wages, though, this information isn't very readily available. So what we did was we looked at one specific sector, construction, and we went through the CBAs of 5 different skilled trades. And what we did was we compared them to CLAC, because CLAC does have some benefits for its members that they're able to get, but it's not going to be as high as traditional unions are. So the difference there gives us some sense of the extent to which unions in this sector are able to negotiate higher non-wage forms of compensation. And what our research found was that overall in these five trade unions, an extra nearly $4 an hour is earned in these other types of compensation. And again, if you calculate that over a full year, full-time occupation, it works out to another $8,000 a year in additional income. And research also shows that it's not just union members that we're talking about, that there's a positive association between the ability of unions to organize and the wages of non-unionized workers. So the easier it is to form unions, the more prevalent they are in an industry, the closer non-unionized wages tend to be to that union wage. And this is also shown to be the case, the vice versa is also true, that if it's harder to unionize and unions are less prevalent in an industry, the non-unionized wages tend to fall even farther below the union wage. So even those workers who are not themselves members of a union and no doubt there should be less of them, can materially benefit from the success of unions in their industry. The other major category that we looked at that unions should be proud of is safety. It was proved much more difficult to quantify the exact impact of unions in this area in a quantifiable way. But what we found from our analysis is that unions are the critical force in ensuring safe workplaces in Alberta, which is particularly important in this province because of how dangerous work is here. In 2012, there were 145 occupational fatalities, and 27,745 workers were injured badly enough to require time off. And there's good reason to believe that that actual figures are much higher than this because of the many more injuries and fatalities that go unreported or workers' compensation claims that go unaccepted. So employers have, for the most part, proven unwilling to eliminate injuries and fatalities at the workplace. Employers view injury prevention in economic rather than moral terms, for the most part. And preventing injuries then only, they choose to do that only when the cost is less than the cost of the injury itself. And the hazards in the workplace which cause injuries are introduced into the workplace by employers trying to maximize their profits. Removing those hazards and preventing injuries can be done, but it's a cost to an employer that they are rarely willing to accept. The provincial government has proven itself unwilling to prevent workplace injuries and fatalities. There is widespread non-compliance with basic occupational health and safety obligations, and the government has not prevented this from happening. It hasn't cracked down. And this stems from the fact that employers face almost no chance of being caught for violating because of, for one thing, there's a lack of government inspections. Workplaces, on average, are inspected less than once every 14 years. And it can take safety inspectors, even when they're told that unsafe work is happening, when it's reported to them, it can take inspectors up to 18 days to respond. And if employers happen to actually get caught by this, by the rare inspection, there's almost no chance that they will be penalized for their actions. More often than not, they're told just to comply, which they should be doing anyways, and prosecutions we've seen have become increasingly rare in the province. So without those two, that leaves workers basically to look out for their own safety. And their ability to do so is greatly enhanced by being a member of a union. Unions have proven through their education of members that union members typically are better informed about what constitutes a workplace hazard. And union members are more empowered with their enhanced job security and the grievance procedures that they have. It means that workers, unionized workers, are more likely to refuse unsafe work, which is their right. Unionized workplaces are also associated with more and frequent OHS inspections. And unions have also politically advocated for improved occupational health and safety legislation. So those are two very important things that unions are doing in this province today that have important material impacts on the lives of everyday workers. But there is also reasons for concern that we found in our research. There are signs that the current trajectory of organized labor in Alberta is unsustainable. And thankfully, I don't think these signs are going to be particularly earth-shattering to anyone who's been paying attention. And I think that the need to do something about them is becoming more commonplace and accepted. So there's three signs that I found. One is that CLAC is by far the fastest growing union. So I'll go into these in more detail in just a second. The second is that union organizing activity is decreasing. And the third is that unions in the province are increasingly restricted to the public sector. So CLAC's rapid growth. This table shows the 10 unions that have organized the most workplaces in Alberta since the year 2000. And I mean, obviously CLAC stands out here because it's not only has it organized the most workplaces, or attempted to organize the most workplaces through its 503 certifications that it's submitted and have been processed. It also has the second highest success rate at doing so, and has gained by far the most bargaining units of any union in Alberta. And because of what we know about CLAC and what I said earlier, this isn't necessarily surprising. Obviously, employers are going to prefer a union that will accede to its demands, but this fact should be very troubling to those of us who think that unions should be a means to worker empowerment. And when you take CLAC out of the picture and you just look at what the traditional labor unions are doing in terms of organizing over the last 15 years or so, we find a troubling trend. For one, is the number of attempts to unionize a workplace has fallen fairly dramatically over the last 15 years. And at the same time, even though they're filing less applications, the success rate has stayed more or less flat over that time period. So we've seen a decrease in overall organizing activity by every union that's not CLAC, or by non-CLAC unions, I should say. And the third and the last troubling sign that we found in our report was about that unions in Alberta are increasingly restricted to the public sector. And I mean, that's not new. We know that unionization has been much stronger in the public sector than in the private sector, both in Alberta and in Canada, for some time. But over the last 16 years, the divergence has grown even starker in Alberta. Of the jobs created since 1997, 64% of those in the public sector were unionized, but only 7% of those jobs in the private sector were unionized. And moreover, of the jobs that have been created since that time, more than 80% were in the private sector. So we see a concentration of new union members coming on in the public sector, while the vast majority of jobs are being created in the private sector. And you can see that in this graph that some of the more troubling industries are the private services. Does this show? Yeah. At the top here. So the financial services, the professional services have seen a lot of job growth over those 15 years or so, but hardly any new union members have come on board. So I think those three signs point to the need for some self-reflection in our labor movement. I was really taken, though, by Jane McAlevy's lecture this morning, and I think she laid out a pretty compelling approach that unions here should seriously consider in the future. So, thank you very much.
Cheap tricks. Thanks, and thanks very much for coming this afternoon. HSAA, Health Sciences Association of Alberta, we call ourselves the Union of Healthcare Professionals. We represent about 24,000 folks in this province in over 240 different occupations. So just to give you an idea, we've got pre-hospital workers like your EMS folks, I think we might have some in the room, diagnostics, laboratory, X-ray, MRI, nuclear medicine, sleep technologists, therapeutic folks who are pharmacists, pharmacy technicians, dietitians, radiation therapists, mental health professionals, rehab, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, my background, child life therapists, and a bunch of others that you may never have heard of or even thought about. Medical library technologists, health information management professionals, biomedical equipment techs. You know, the people who manage and make sure the artificial hearts are working. Some of those people are so esoteric that I thank heavens they know what they're doing. I'm tempted to simply point to David's report and say in healthcare, the union premium is 23%. What more do I need to say about the value of unions? So, and you would think with that healthcare and social services workers would be just flocking to our doors, and in the public sector we are pretty saturated as far as healthcare employees, but there's lots of privatization, as we all know. Nevertheless, we have had, as you saw, a pretty good track record of organizing and growth in the past couple of decades. But you know, part of the reasons I think we've lost the number of organizing is if they've kept us so busy at the Labour Board with the regionalization, re-regionalization, reorganizing, that who's had time to do anything new as far as organizing. Now, the majority of my members are direct Alberta Health Services employees, so direct government agency employees. Covenant, which is technically a separate legal entity, but also runs the hospitals here, you know, Misericordia, Grey Nuns, etc. But we also represent a number of folks in non-governmental units, including Canadian Blood Services, Associated Ambulance, Good Samaritan Society, Child and Adolescent Services, etc. Now, one of our largest units, and the chair is in the room, is Dynalite Medical Labs, which is a private for-profit operator, and with its base in Edmonton, substantial number of workers, and it also works in Edmonton, Fort McMurray, Red Deer, and some other groups. I mentioned this group, first of all, because they are private, and secondly, because we only organized them in 2008, and that's a whole long story. I could take my whole time talking about those organizing drives. The reason I mentioned it is I think it's fair to say that these workers, based on what we heard last night and this morning about activism, these workers are some of our most activist members. They had to fight to have a union in their workplace. And so they really understand the value of being part of a union. Unlike most of our members, they spend years in post-secondary education, so virtually 90-95% of our members have post-secondary education. They've spent years and tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars getting their education to get those credentials to become a health professional in what they practice. Then they go out and find a job, and the union happens to come with them. So they aren't trade unionists by background. They aren't coming at us as red diaper babies. They aren't much different from other workers. They have to be convinced, and they have been exposed to all the and anti-union rhetoric that we've heard all along. You know, unions are too powerful, they protect the deadwood, they've outlived their usefulness, etc. And of course you've seen that here where that usefulness is anything but outlived. And I dare say our history, we were formed in 1971, has been one where early on our members by and large thought of their union dues as a service fee. I pays my dues and now do something for me, but don't ask me to do anything for you. Now that hasn't been exclusive, that hasn't been universal, but it has been pretty true, and we've been working pretty darn hard to change that to saying, let's understand that our dues are a collective responsibility that we use for the common good. And we've been working real hard. So our first job then, when we get our new members, when the employer hires them, is to find them, because we don't always know where they're at. And then once we find them, to tell them that, first of all, you are part of a union, and it would be good if you signed a card, because there's some benefits that you don't get if you don't sign a card, but what the benefit is to all of us and generally. And it isn't always clear. It isn't really uncommon for them to say, you know, what am I getting for my dues? And again, our dues are 1.25% of gross basic pay, gross pay including overtime. And you get 23% for 1.25%. I did the calculation, somewhere around 1,800% return on investment. Try to get that in the markets. You know, but that doesn't entirely cut it, because we do have to ensure that we understand their workplace issues, that we negotiate good collective agreements, and I'm actually hoping to hear this weekend that we've done that, because our provincial bargaining committee is in mediation as we speak. So if I suddenly jump up and down, it might be because I got a message here that we have a deal. So keep your fingers crossed for us, please. And once we have that contract, we of course have to enforce it for them. That said, we're also committed, and have been for some time, to the idea that simply bargaining good collective agreements is not good enough. Many years ago, we adopted our mission statement, which says that our mission is to enhance the quality of life of our members and of society. And yeah, we actually believe that there is such a thing as society, Margaret Thatcher. Our members, thank you. Our members are part of that society. They live in our communities. They're your brothers, your sisters, your aunts, uncles, your neighbors, your friends. And we have long understood that the natural result of unionization often trickles down to the whole community, because employers try to keep unions out by trying to get close to matching union wages, right? They don't want a union in place. And so, and the health benefits that people get, a lot of that trickles down to the community. Our members who earn good money spend their wages in our communities. They spend them at their local businesses, and they contribute to that local community. I've spoken with one of our members who says, we are fortunate insofar as we have a really good wage. So when we have full-time employment, we actually have the luxury of being able to spend some of our time helping our communities through volunteer work. We don't have to cobble together 3 minimum wage jobs just to put food on the table. That said, we also have some folks who choose to be casual employees because they love the flexibility of being able to say, yep, no thanks, I'm not coming in. I don't need to. And for those, that's fine, and part-timers. But we've also seen, even in our unionized environment, a lot of precarious employment. So people have to start as casuals, hope that they get called for shifts, and hope that at some point they get a full-time job. And that keeps them often quite compliant and quite reluctant to rock the boat, because they are hoping for that full-time job. Now, our view is that our obligations extend beyond the collective agreement. That's not just from a sense of altruism. That is from a sense of self-interest. Because we've experienced the assault on union rights by governments and big capital, and we understand that the rights that we have today can be struck out with a stroke of the legislative pen. And we have railed against that for some time. You will hopefully have heard about Bill 45, the legislation that our government passed that says if you even so much as think about striking in the public sector, we will fine you out of existence. They haven't yet proclaimed it, but it has been passed, so we need to go further. Sorry, I just lost my page here. So, yeah. In 2003, we chose to affiliate with the House of Labour. We were an independent union. We weren't part of the Federation of Labour. We were really insular. And since then, we are part of the Federation, part of the National Union of Public and General Employees, as Heather said. And we understand that we have a larger contribution to make to the movement, as well as gaining the benefits of working with others. We understand that while we enjoy robust union density in the public sector, the private sector, as David's study shows so clearly, has been shrinking. And if we continue to lose private sector unionization, they're going to be coming after us next, or they're going to continue to foster the ethos of envy. We're going to envy those public sector workers because somehow or other people think that we are at the trough, we are getting those gold-plated benefits and pensions. And so making sure and working with other unions, private sector unions, and by the way, following our members into the private sector if they are privatized, will help to ensure that we protect our effectiveness, and if I want to be getting into hyperbole, our very existence needs to be protected. Early in our affiliation with the House of Labour, our National Unions Convention had a theme of the common good, Commonwealth for the common good. And our affiliates in the National Union are overwhelmingly public sector unions. We understand that public services are not only our very jobs, but they are good for our community. So we've been fighting for good public services all along. 3 years ago, my union adopted a strategic plan. It's a big, hairy, audacious goal, as we call it. And that said that our members and the public will understand and value unions. Our members and the public will understand and value unions. A pretty lofty goal. It's not going to be easy to achieve because we've got a lot of work to do, but it's going to take some time, and we're going to challenge ourselves to ensure that everything we do goes toward that ethos, that our members and the public will understand and value our unions. The first thing is good collective agreements, good benefits, and carry on with that. But we also work to connect with our communities, and not only with the usual choir, those who are trade unionists through and through, but we work to counter the negative stereotypes that are out there. Those suggest that somehow being part of a union is incompatible with being part of our communities, and we need to change that. We need to change the question from how do I take something away from those wealthy union workers who have such good benefits and good pensions and all that, to say, wait a minute, that looks pretty good to me. How do I get me a union? And that's the question that we need to do, to counter the discourse of envy with the hopefully discourse of there's something in it for me and for our communities. And that discourse, of course, is now the concerted effort of the larger labour movement. The Canadian Labour Congress has been waging a Together Fairness Works. You've probably seen the ads with the sunny, the popsicle stick, right? Talking about all the good things that unions have got for us over the years. And it is designed expressly to improve the image of unions. And statistics show that that has actually been working quite well. The first stats suggested that the approval rating, or people who thought positively about unions, general public, was around 32-33%, and after that one run of that ad, it went up to 49%. It's a huge statistical increase just by that effort. So that is going to continue. We at Health Sciences have been engaging in an imaging campaign to connect the trusted health professionals. Most people, when you tell them, you know, I'm a pharmacist, I'm a lab technologist, I'm an EMT, paramedic, they think those are the heroes in our system. Those are great folks. We need to connect them with, they happen to also be union members, and so that people don't see union members as somehow with horns out of their heads and not part of the community, that these are the respected people that they know. And that's where we're going. Our national union's version of the campaign is called All Together Now, and we've recently engaged that through what we called our Fairness Express, and you may have seen one of our members in a green t-shirt, if you see him, his name is Jason, embarrass him, that talks about the Fairness Express. And we took this big green bus throughout the country and 40 places in Alberta, and we didn't necessarily go to union meetings. We went everywhere except union meetings to talk about what is happening in our country. The fact that we have attacks on labor rights which lead to decreased union density. The fact that we have no industrial strategy, we're just digging stuff out of the ground and cutting down the trees and shipping them off for somebody else to manufacture, and rather than creating good, well-paying jobs in this country, the McJobs that we have. The tax policy, which you heard about today, that actually specifically leads to increased income inequality. And the counter then is to strengthen labor rights, improve union density, get that modern industrial strategy going, get tax fairness so that we reduce income inequality. We found that even in Alberta, that message resonated with people who are not union members. We specifically and expressly and deliberately went to places that weren't our choir. because we needed to spread that message. We're hoping to run another cross-country tour next spring, this time specifically to talk about universal childcare. And again, you heard from the plenary earlier how well that should do, and we're carrying on with that. One other effort we're doing within our union is we're supporting members to participate in community events, whether it's the local fair or the local, let's clean up the park, or let's do a run for this, that, or the other good cause, the women's shelters, etc., to show that union members are part of the community. So we give them a t-shirt, it might be bright yellow with our logo on it, just to get people asking, who is that? And that's my union, and my union is supporting this effort, again, to make sure that they understand we're part of that community. We strive to support private sector unions to organize workers so that more of our citizens can benefit from the union advantage. And we understand that bolstering that private sector unionization is going to be good for all of us to make sure that we keep unions working. We are encouraged by polling that demonstrates some success in that public image, but we aren't under any illusion that we have anything but a pretty daunting task ahead of us. We know that the profiteers will outspend us, and that our governments, both federal and provincial, seem more intent on undermining the public services rather than justify privatization. Here in Alberta, you will have heard that the latest effort is to send $3 billion of our tax dollars over 15 years to an Australian company called Sonic to outsource medical laboratories in the Edmonton zone, and it's going to go beyond that. And I'd encourage all of us to write to our MLAs to say, what the heck are you doing? Show me and prove to me, and let me know what that contract is going to look like, because I don't believe for 1 minute that it's in the public interest to offshore that work. So we haven't been particularly successful in trying to counter the Sonic event, but we are determined to ensure that the members that we represent will continue to have a union to be represented by that. We've also been working to increase local and membership activism and focusing much of our education there. And then we support and work with our social partners, as has been mentioned, PIA, Friends of Medicare, Alberta Council of Women's Shelters, Calgary Workers Resource Centre, etc. Knowing that the work that those organizations do helps to support our positions, they also broaden the discussion beyond employment-related issues and create that multiplier effect of our voices. So our members have told us through polling that they expect us to be active politically, and we are doing that. We are expanding our efforts there, and we want to make sure that our members understand the message that I just said, that we can do brilliant things for them at the bargaining table. If the government does, no, not so much, that is a lot of waste, and that is definitely related to their communities and their lives. We've got lots of work to do. We're committed to doing that. And that's how we're going to fulfill our mission to improve and enhance the quality of life of our members, and our strategic plan that our members and the public will understand and value unions. Thank you.
If I had known we were going to do props there, Elisabeth, I would have brought a little set of those horns out of my tickle trunk. Because, of course, we are the big bad demons, right? The bad labor people. You'll notice a lot of overlap or similarities between Elisabeth's Union Health Sciences Association of Alberta and United Nurses of Alberta. But I do have some remarks. We represent about 30,000, and that was mentioned in the intro, about 30,000 registered nurses, registered psychiatric nurses. We do also have a few licensed practical nurses and a few nursing people at all, because they work in a hospice that we represent in Calgary, and we have everybody in the work site. The vast majority are registered nurses. We do not represent nurse practitioners, and I'm saying this now because it links through to actually the report and what has happened in this province with respect to legislation. We used to have registered nurse practitioners, But as nurse practitioners formally became more involved and more utilized in healthcare, the government actually passed a piece of legislation that said they were not permitted to belong to a union. It just so happened that that was exactly at the same moment we were at a bargaining table attempting to achieve a higher rate of compensation and recognition of their skill level, but they are, to this day, prohibited from being part of a union. We have members working in acute care and in community and long-term care. There's not a lot, but the corrections, Alberta Corrections Services, Canadian Blood Services would be another one. But the vast majority of nurses in this province today are employed by the same people who employ the majority of Elisabeth's members, and that's Alberta Health Services. And I have to say that the first time I actually heard somebody say to me, or I had somebody say to me, that nurses didn't need to be unionized, that there was a time when unions were necessary, but they're now no longer necessary. The first time that was actually said to me was in 1989, and I happened to be involved in trying to negotiate a first contract for nurses working in community in our far north, high-level Fort Vermilion area. They had been attempting to get a first contract at that point for 2 years, and of course, Alberta is one of those very labor-friendly legislative areas where there is no such thing as a mandatory first collective agreement, which should have been the answer to the person who said it to me. Yeah, if they don't need a union, then why is it taking 2 years to get a contract? But that is a very dominant sensation or a dominant belief that has been held in Alberta for many years now. And for those of you who were here through the 80s and 90s and the whole reinventing government, you'll see that the legislative positions that government has taken has certainly reflected that they don't want them, and they're going to do the best they can to convince people they don't need them. A few years ago, the Alberta Federation of Labour celebrated their 100th anniversary. And we as nurses and health sciences and all the other members of the Alberta Federation of Labour were active and enthusiastic participants in that. But in fact, for nurses, not just here in Alberta, but across Canada, for nurses, unionization, being a union, part of a union, is actually relatively new. It wasn't until 1973, in fact, that nurses' unions even started to evolve, and that only because of a Supreme Court decision that said there should be a separation, because up until that time, all of the negotiations for nurses as employees was done by, in fact, nurse managers. But there was so we had started to have a separation. United Nurses of Alberta started to be formed here in 1976. We had our first annual meeting in 1977. But unionism and union ethics are actually fairly new in the nursing community. That doesn't mean we didn't embrace it. In 1977, we had our first strike. It was only 7 hospitals actually in the province, but it was a huge event. It included my hospital. We had our first strike. We went out. We were ordered back to work, and we went, and we were off to arbitration. Now, I'm mentioning this because at the time there was some other legislative framework around us, including wage controls. In fact, when we went on strike, there were some key issues. One was a desire to achieve the RAND formula, the automatic dues checkoff. A second one was to achieve something called professional responsibility. And a third significant element in that strike was, of course, simple wages. Because of who had done and represented nurses up until that point, we were significantly behind a whole lot of other workers in Alberta. And that wasn't just the case here, again, for nurses. It was the case right across Canada, that nurses' wages had some big leaps in the 70s and late 70s and into the 80s because of how low they had been. Anyways, we went on strike, ordered back. We were ordered to arbitration. The award for wages was actually higher than the wage control, 6%. We were the arbitration board ruled 9%, but refused to grant our union, our newly formed union, either the RAND formula or the much desired professional responsibility clause. In fact, the decision of the arbitrator was that, quote, the sailors don't tell the captain how to run the ship. Okay? So, we had another strike in 1980. We went out, were ordered back, we didn't go. We ended up 80, 82. 83, the government brought in legislation that took away the right to strike, flat out. They thought that was going to be the end of it, these nasty nurses, all these, uppity things. Although after the 1980 strike, it took 2 strikes, but we did get our professional responsibility clause, and I'm going to mention that because it's important to what I think unions do for workers and for the public. Took 2 strikes to get something called professional responsibility. Went on strike again in 82. As I said, the government changed the legislation, took away the right to strike, thought they had settled us down. In fact, in 1988, we had the biggest, most supported strike we ever had right across the province. Hospitals that hadn't gone out previously, and by 1988, we were pretty much representing I would say 80-90% of the nurses who were organized. There was a sister union, Staff Nurses Association, which was the University Hospital here in Edmonton. But 88, we were told we couldn't even vote. That was the ruling. We didn't have the right to strike, and the Labor Board ruled that we weren't allowed to vote. We had the biggest turnout for the vote that we conducted, and the biggest turnout for a strike in our history. And 19 days, illegal. We had nurses in this province hiding, expecting in rural Alberta that the RCMP were going to come and literally cart them off. What is important in terms of what happened in 88 is what happened in 2013. In 1988, that 19-day strike, we were fined. We lost wages, obviously, and we were fined. Our fines totaled $450,000, most of which was paid by other unions, donations from across Canada and from other countries. The legislation that was passed in December of 2013, but not yet proclaimed, is Bill 45. If that strike was to have occurred with Bill 45 in place, that strike would have cost us $50 million. We would have lost dues deductions for 2 years. Nurses would have been personally fined, I think it's $6,000, $8,000 each. What I'm trying to identify is that part of the reason that we have declining, in some ways declining organizing and union representation in this province is because the organizing ability and the density of unions goes down, I think, in direct proportion to how bad the legislation gets. The worse the legislative environment, including making it harder even to organize in the first place. We've gone from just a card count to, in fact, a card count and then a vote where employers have more time than you would think they would need, but more time, have ample time in which to intimidate and discourage employees from joining unions. Okay. We, like health sciences, were insular for quite a while. We had our union. We did, in the 90s, start some mergers in terms of other nursing unions, but we were late going into both the provincial and the federal House of Labor. But I think now that we are there, I think both our unions, in fact, contribute something different, and I think don't want to hit. But I think some of it has to do with who we represent and the fact that a great percentage, and in my case, a vast majority of the people we represent are in fact women. Okay. When we first organized as a union, of course, our concentration tended to be a lot on addressing the pay inequities and in the workplace, so issues in the workplace. But other priorities included, as I said, the Professional Responsibility Committee and Occupational Health and Safety. Again, Alberta is one, if not the only jurisdiction, I think, that does not have a requirement for joint occupational health and safety committees. And our first agreements really, when they talked about safety, they weren't talking about worker safety, they were talking about building safety. Right? So you got the how to do the fire drills, but they didn't give a damn if you knew how to lift a patient and prevent back injuries. Benefits was another thing where benefits and pensions. Prior to, I think it was 82, women who were married were not even permitted to participate in the pension plan, the local authorities' pension plan. So if you married, you stopped being able to participate. It wasn't mandatory, and in fact, many employers denied participation by part-time employees. Health benefits in our early contracts were virtually non-existent and dependent on what the employer chose to give you. But again, in the early 80s, we started to see things like long-term disability and short-term disability and those kinds of things. But also, once we started to stabilize sort of the workplace, that is when we really started to identify and started to fulfill the other expectation of our founding union. Because not only did we talk about advancing the socioeconomic wealth or being of nurses, but we talked about it in a broader context as well. My personal involvement with United Nurses of Alberta started after we achieved our Professional Responsibility Committee. The first sort of public event I ever represented UNA at was actually during the discussions of the Canada Health Act. Here in Alberta, there was a Friends of Medicare formed, and as part of the Canadian Health Coalition's efforts to pass have the Canada Health Act proceed. And I think that speaks about what happens in this province. When we need to, labor can come together, and labor does come together. And that has held us well, because throughout the 90s, we were absolutely dependent on not just labor supporting labor, but the public supporting labor, and us supporting each other in trying to, in many ways, defend what we had already achieved. There are many people in this room I know who will remember the days of Bill 11 and privatization and private hospitals. And what we found was absolutely imperative, not only to our personal interests as workers in healthcare, but to our families' interests, our community's interests, was the need to bring together coalitions, and not just of unions, but of seniors and other citizen groups. That's when, Gordon's back there, the whole notion of the Parkland Institute was first conceived of, a need to go beyond and push back on the rhetoric against things like healthcare and workers and recognition of worker rights. As health sciences, we, the coalitions and activities that came about through the 90s that I think poise us for actually making changes included Parkland, Public Interest Alberta, we've got the Friends of Medicare. We also support things such as the Labour History Institute, because it's important we don't forget our history. As some would say, we're bound to repeat it again. Things like the Aspen Foundation, things like the Next Stop, investing in future generations of youth in terms of their involvement, not just as members perhaps of labor, but as leaders in our communities and helping us whether they're in a unionized job or not, in terms of making the changes that really count. Elisabeth and I had a chat about this, and I have said this quite often. I've attended and I've been at bargaining tables since the mid-'80s. And we've achieved a lot at our bargaining table, but we've achieved things that go way beyond what is achievable at a bargaining table in other ways. Perhaps it's been at appeals in terms of human rights and things that we have achieved in terms of pushing back mandatory retirement for nurses, changing the laws around maternity leave, for instance. When we advocate outside of our union, we benefit as well. We are currently actively with the Canadian Health Coalition and Friends of Medicare and our national union and CLC out there talking about things like pharmacare, a long-term care strategy, wanting to position not just labor, but citizens as we go into a federal election. When we do these things, when we put the energy into the organizations that we call our friends, we benefit, our families benefit, but it's also things that I don't have to then try to achieve at a bargaining table. I would much rather see pharmacare and benefits for all people than just for the people I represent. So if I achieve it outside, and really that's a lot of what we do. I'm going to sort of end with a couple of things here because I think I'd like some time for questions. I mentioned professional responsibility, and I'm going to mention it again. We just had our annual general meeting, some 800 nurses in the room. And we have representatives, delegates from across the province. We have structured ourselves so that every work site has, in fact, a union representative. We've done all kinds of stuff in terms of, almost 20 years ago, we ensured that every one of our locals, we have 164 across the province, that every one of our locals was connected into a network, a computer network, so that we do all of that. But that does not change the need to have the one-on-one engagement, whether you're talking about unions or you're talking about what you do in terms of the public. At this most recent meeting, again and again, nurses came to Mike's. We have something called the Open Forum, and talked about their workplace and talked about concerns they had, and not just because, it may affect or may endanger, in some cases, their health and well-being, but when they talked about things like elder abuse and child poverty, and the discussions were very, very broad. I have incredible pride in that, to know that my union, my members, will actually think beyond their own immediate needs and ask, what can we do to address things like child poverty in the province of Alberta? But a lot of their concerns relate to their increasing moral distress related to there just not being enough staff. There not being the right mix of staff, and there's simply not being enough staff. And that's the case whether you're talking acute care or you're talking long-term care. We address those kinds of things, or try to address those kinds of things, through something called professional responsibility, where we can take an issue, identify an issue, we can file work. Today, you do sort of used to call them complaints, we call them concerns. You fill out a form and identify what's happening right now. We had over 2,500 concerns, documented concerns from nurses in the last 12 months. Almost all of them related to concerns about inadequate, unsafe staffing. When we advocate for staffing, we don't just advocate because we don't want to do so much work. We advocate because we believe it is unsafe. And if it's unsafe from our perspective, that means it's unsafe for the patients. And the less staff and more diluted the skill mix you have, the greater risks, again, you have of adverse events, infections, falls, deaths. We are, you'll see us, you'll see, and we have a campaign going on right now, Wear White. Nurses unions across Canada, in fact, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, PEI, most recently Ontario, have adopted a Wear White campaign because they want the public to understand how concerned they are about safe staffing. You can't have safe staffing, you can't have patient safety, which is the big focus in the healthcare system today, unless you have safe staffing. And I have to tell you that 2 weeks ago, I was at a conference on patient safety. It was Patient Safety Week. And an individual who was for many years an administrative person in places like the University Hospital, the Glenrose Hospital. For several years, he headed up Rivera, which is a long-term care group, actually stood at this conference talking about patient safety and said that staffing and patient safety is a red herring. Mm-hmm. That there is no relationship. In fact, it is an inextricable relationship. So we will, and I'm saying this to you because we will be asking the public to understand what we are talking about and join nurses and others, because it's not just nurses. It's EMS crews, it's lab, it's in terms of creating safe staffing environments. There were a few things in the report that I just wanted to bring your attention to, and if you haven't seen the report that David was talking about, it's you should. I just wanted to point to page 25, David, because you said, and this was about how important unions are in terms of health and safety, and that rather the risks workers face reflect decisions employers make, decisions about what, when, where, and how goods and services are produced. Employers make these decisions with the goal of maximizing profitability. How does that translate into the public sector? Because it makes sense in the private sector, you want better profits. The way it translates in healthcare is, in fact, in the public sector, it's not so much that they're looking to increase their returns in terms of maximizing their profits. What they are trying to do is reduce their costs, except, of course, in much of the long-term care environment, which is where you still see strikes today, because in the private, for-profit long-term care environment, that's exactly what they do. I'm told to wrap up, so I will. The last line on the report. I said we had our convention, our annual meeting this week, and Gil spoke at it, and I had made a comment. And Gil's talked about the upcoming AFL convention next April, where the theme is Dream No Little Dreams, taken from the book about Tommy Douglas and his government in Saskatchewan. I said I had a sort of like that, and it was from an obscure British TV show called Red Dwarf, and the cat said, if you never had a dream, you never had a dream come true. And I look at the report as I read it again, and it says, looking to the past, the history of labor organizing in Canada suggests that the labor movement has done better when it has dreamed bigger. And that's what we do in us.
So we're actually at 3:44, so we've run out of time. If we can take a couple questions if you want to stay. If there's any burning questions anybody wants to ask. One at the back, very back. We'll take like 3 questions and then we'll go.
Hello there. My question is for Sister Ballermann. Please don't take this critically. I say this simply because it's perhaps something to think about. I'm not sure who said it, but if you don't own your own truth, everyone will call you a liar. So my question is, if we do have a problem as a union movement in terms of image, is not calling yourself an association sort of running away from that truth?
Very valid point. Discussion we've had in our union a number of times. We have come to the conclusion at this point that there are plenty of unions out there who have worked with the word association all along and still are a union. But it's a fair point, and you know, at some point, if our members get to the point of majority saying we want to change the name, then we absolutely will do that. But it is a fair point.
Down here at the front in green.
Thank you all. We learned this morning from Jane about the distinction between mobilizing and organizing. And the members of Heather's and Elisabeth unions, by and large, they're among the most trusted professionals in the eyes of the public. And so I'm just wondering, actually Elisabeth alluded to how a lot of the members sort of complacently accept membership in the union and they contribute their dues, and that's the extent of their involvement. But given the public trust and what Jane was talking to us this morning about organizing rather than mobilizing, how can we kind of harness the power and the trust that our members have with the public to achieve the vision that you were talking about with the members and the public understanding the value of unions?
I don't see another one.
Really good point. Most of our members say, you know, what I want to do is I want to practice my profession and leave all that stuff to others. We have been working really, really hard for 10, 15 years to get the message across that you are part of a union. You need to understand that you're part of a union, and you need to use that trust. And we're trying to link through our public imaging campaign that trust with their union membership, so that we can say to the public, you know, these people are really high. They're the people you trust with your lives, with your very lives, and they also happen to be trade unionists. And so, how do you connect the anti-union? Unions are evil ethos with these are your trusted health professionals. So we're very consciously trying to make that link, and that is part of our current campaign.
And I think we have been successful in terms of with the public when we need it. Then I think about, we used to call it the Friday group, which was an eclectic collection of people who were concerned about what was happening in healthcare would get together. And it wasn't just unions, it was a wide range. And I think they came partly because there was faith in the people that were organizing it. In terms of members, and you know, what is important is that you stay connected and you keep your members informed, because it's unrealistic to expect that, you know, you're always going to get 30,000 people out on every issue. But when you need them, they will come if you stay connected and engaged with them. We had a perfect example of that over the last year. Certainly reactions to things like Bill 45 and Bill 46, but the reaction of workers, and not just workers, but people who could see the unfairness of the attack on the public sector pension plans in this province, and went to the meetings that, the hearings that the government put on. You know, Gil has talked about this. The coalition of unions mobilized. It mobilized unions, it mobilized the public, and I think it did it because there is a credibility to the messaging, and it wasn't seen as just self-centered. The messaging that we continually put out is, yes, we have pension plans. They're not gold-plated. We paid for them. That's deferred income, and we think every Albertan should have income security. It's not just we weren't saying don't take it away from us. We're saying don't take it away from us and give income security to every Albertan, and Albertans and union people did come out.
Thank you all for coming, and thank